We are about to start in a few minutes, so may I request everyone to please settle down. Meantime, some reminders. Kindly make sure that you register today using the QR codes in your IDs. You will also need to register tomorrow to ensure that you are able to get your certificates from this summit. For the materials, kindly scan the QR codes flashed on the screen. You may also find this in your tables. It also contains your session assignment for today. Meanwhile, if you're curious about the exhibit outside, those are actually products of PDLs from the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, and they are on sale. We will start in a few minutes. Thank you.
The reason why there is always a problem sa jails, nagsisiksikan. Siyempre magkakainitan yan, mag-aaway, magkakasakit. If you don't properly modernize facilities, provide the required workforce, and provide efficient correctional services, you will be releasing problems. To make rehabilitation more effective, we must see it as a continuum, where from the moment of incarceration to the PDL's reintegration, agencies are provided with the necessary resources. This includes better facilities, more trained personnel, psychosocial support, and adequate legal aid. Yung Justice Sector Coordinating Council really plays an important role here because justice is not only rendered by the courts. Nandyan muna yung police to the prosecution, then to the courts, and then correctional, and then to the community. Lahat yan nangangailangan ng budget.
Our criminal justice framework is grounded in restorative justice. This is why humane conditions of detention are not optional, but essential.
The good news is that there is already a strong foundation for cooperation, coordination through GoJust and related platforms. GoJust 2 has supported national and local coordination through Justice Sector Coordinating Councils and the establishment of justice zones, advanced automation in courts and prosecution offices, and promoting the use of research and data in justice policy.
The court recognizes, however, that more needs to be done. Overcrowded jails strain government resources, endanger the health and mortality of PDLs, and undermine rehabilitation efforts.
Despite the limits in time and resources, we have persevered, and the justice sector has so visibly shown that when we work together, we achieve great things.
Ensuring humane detention is therefore not an act of leniency. It is a reaffirmation of the values that define a just, effective, and credible justice system.
It is about ensuring that justice is not delayed, distorted, or denied.
Long-term goals and legal reform matter so that people know what to expect and institutions can deliver what the law intends.
A person deprived of liberty should not be a person deprived of dignity.
Every person deserves to be treated with humanity and respect.
And a justice system that treats every human being, victim, accused, or detainee, with dignity.
Reflect a deliberate shift towards early and humane interventions. And with realities that we continue to face, decongestion remains to be a continuing and collective responsibility.
This demonstrates that with the right resources, coordination, and political will, meaningful decongestion is achievable.
I commend the GSCC and all its partners for their commitment to meaningful reform. And I am confident that discussion in this summit will help shape a justice system that is more effective, more human, and more worthy of public trust.
Let us all help in the rehabilitation of PDLs because anyone, from the lowest to the highest citizen, can go to prison. Anyone.
Anyone can go to jail, and that is exactly why we are gathered here this morning to discuss how best to resolve a persistent and long-standing problem plaguing our prison and jail system. As of December 2025, the Bureau of Corrections reported a congestion rate of 214% in its 7 prison facilities, while the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology said its congestion rate is at 279% in 488 city, district, and municipal jails across the country. What does this mean in actual numbers? We're talking about more than 53,000 persons deprived of liberty incarcerated in Bucor prisons, meant to house only less than 17,000 PDLs. Meanwhile, there are more than 114,000 PDLs detained in BJMP jails whose ideal capacity is only about 51,000 PDLs. So I let the numbers sink in. I know it's quite a lot because it's early in the morning. So good morning, everybody. I am Attorney Mike Navalio, Supreme Court Chief Communications Officer, and welcome to this day 2 of the second National Decongestion Summit organized by the Justice Sector Coordinating Council. Thank you all for joining us here at the Manila Hotel today and tomorrow. A very warm welcome to our delegates from the 16 justice zones all over the country. Magandang umaga, maayong buntag. And let me acknowledge at this point some of our very special guests this morning, beginning with Supreme Court Associate Justice Maria Filomena Dising. Good morning, Justice. Appellate Court Justices. Good morning, Justices. Members of the JSCC Technical Working Group, the chairpersons and the vice chairpersons, DOJ Undersecretary Deo Marco and officials of the DOJ, officials of the Department of the Interior and Local Government, members of the Steering Committee of the National Decongestion Summit, Parole and Probation Administrator Bienvenido Benitez, Justice Zone conveners and members, participants from the justice sector agencies. We have the National Prosecution Service, Public Attorney's Office, the BJMP, the PNP or Philippine National Police, the Bureau of Corrections, and acknowledge the presence of Director General Gregorio Catapang Jr. Good morning, sir. Good morning as well to partners from the Australian Embassy, GoJust3, EU GoJust3, and UNODC. We also have with us the President of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, Alan Capulong. Good morning, Attorney Capulong. And let me also acknowledge, this is quite a long list, so please bear with me. Participating civil service organizations, we have the Alternative Law Groups, ALG, Sentro ng Alternatibong Linga Panligal or Saligan, Ateneo Human Rights Center, Initiatives for Dialogue and Empowerment through Alternative Legal Services or IDEALS, Free Legal Assistance Group, National Union of People's Lawyers, the Medical Action Group, the Humanitarian Legal Assistance Foundation, the Philippine Jesuit Prison Service Foundation, Amnesty International Philippines, Karapatan, Prisoners Enhancement and Support Organization, UP Institute of Human Rights, the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, the Center for Trade Union and Human Rights, the Legal Aid Society of the Philippines, Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, KNK Children Without Borders Philippines, Caritas Manila, and if there is any organization that I forgot to mention, our apologies, but welcome to day 2 of the second National Decongestion Summit. So before we begin, let me just give you a quick rundown of our sessions today. We will start with our first session, the plenary session, which will be led by Associate Justice Maria Filomena Dising. And we will be talking about the experiences of some of former PDLs and how that will help in coming up with legislation. Later this morning, we will have 4 sessions. We have 1 session on the Restorative Justice Handbook of the UNODC. The second session is on protocols for women in conflict with the law. The third session will be about the CLEP experience and law students' engagement in decongestion, and session 4, democratizing GCTA calculation to boost timely releases. So this will be in breakout sessions. We will have 4 breakout sessions, 1 here and 3 at the back of our stage. So this afternoon, we will also have another plenary session, and we will also have 4 breakout sessions. Please note that our plenary sessions are live streamed on Facebook and on YouTube, and we also have video recordings of our breakout sessions. So yesterday, our principals had the chance to sign a wall of commitment, and very briefly, let me just go through some of the matters that they affirmed yesterday. For instance, strengthening diversion, restorative justice, and community-based mechanisms, expansion of non-custodial measures such as probation and bail reform, improvement of access of persons deprived of liberty to quality free legal services, creation of pathways for safe and timely releases of persons deprived of liberty, protection of rights and addressing specific needs of vulnerable populations, and the passage of the comprehensive laws and policies on correctional governance, investments in infrastructure, and modernization of penal facilities to expand capacity. So I know we're all waiting now for our first session. Let me now introduce to you our moderator for the first plenary session. the 194th Associate Justice of the Philippines, who also serves as the chairperson of the Justice Sector Coordinating Council Technical Working Group on Processes and Capacity Building, ladies and gentlemen, Associate Justice Maria Filomena Dising. We would also like to invite to the stage our speakers, Dwayne Antojado, lecturer from Adelaide University in Australia, Awande Mishotana, People's Legal Center, South Africa, and Mary Jane Fabregas Gabrino from Person Restored of Liberty. So let me give the floor now to Justice Singh.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first plenary session of our summit. This is entitled From Experience to Policy Participation of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated People in Policy Making. So just as context setting, one of the underlying themes of the two-day summit is that the lived experience of persons restored to liberty is an important policy-making tool, and we should not limit it to merely anecdotal or narrative testimonies or stories, but we should maximize the use of these testimonies as a basis for shaping policy and solutions and even methodologies moving forward. And so for this, we will have a 1-hour session leaving a few minutes, 20 minutes, for your comments or observations or questions for our experts. And do take advantage of their presence, because it's not every day that we have them with us. And once I introduce them to you, you'll be so amazed at their respective backgrounds. And so the first speaker that we have today is Dwayne Antojado. Welcome, Dwayne. Dwayne is a lecturer in criminology and sociology at Adelaide University. Dwayne will speak on how lived experience knowledge can be ethically embedded within the criminal justice policy-making processes. Dwayne is internationally recognized, and his work has become influential within the emerging field of lived experience criminology. His scholarship is grounded in his own lived experience of Australia's criminal legal system, an orientation that deeply informs both the ethical commitments and intellectual contributions of his work. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's listen to Dwayne Antojado.
I believe I'm on this side, and is my presentation up? Okay. Okay. So good morning, distinguished guests, fellow speakers, and representatives from the many criminal justice organizations gathered here today. My name is Dwayne Antojado, and I'm a lecturer in criminology and sociology at Adelaide University. I also speak from lived experience of imprisonment, having been incarcerated in Australia. That experience continues to shape my academic work, and it now informs how I think about what prison reform looks like, both ethically and practically. Today, I'm here to share insights on how we can meaningfully involve people with lived experience of imprisonment in prison reform efforts in the Philippines, not as an afterthought, but indeed as a core source of expertise. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge and honor the people on this panel and those across the conference who also bring lived experience of prisons and the broader criminal legal system. I stand alongside them in the hope that our collective contributions can help inspire change that is grounded in lived experience, wisdom, and knowledges, and attentive to what reform might actually look like from the inside out. I will need my slides at some point.
Okay, I'll wait. Okay. So, this is the first session of the summit, and I think it feels really timely to begin with a brief language guide for the days ahead. Across this conference and across this summit, there will be people present with lived experience of incarceration, people who have been labeled as offenders, inmates, and criminals. Now, these labels, as we might all know, are not neutral. They can reduce complex human lives to a single category, and they often follow people long after imprisonment. So for this conference, I encourage all of us to use person-centered language throughout the summit. Wherever possible, use people's names. We have lanyards. And when speaking more generally, consider phrases such as people in prison, people who have been to prison, people that are formally incarcerated, instead of prisoners, offenders, and criminals. Now, this is not just about politeness, but rather this is about recognizing the dignity and affirming the humanity of the people we speak about. Now, I'm often invited to speak about lived experience in criminal justice policy making and prison reform, and this has indeed been a central focus of my academic work. When I reflect on lived experience, or what lived experience means in this space, I understand it more than as an individual story. It's a community, a collective of people who have been subject to state-sanctioned harm, and to be blunt, incarceration is precisely that. Within that community, people come together in deliberate and productive ways to build a community of practice, one grounded in shared learning, solidarity, and a commitment to ensuring others do not have to endure the same fate that we did. At the same time, we also know that conferences like this, by their very nature, cannot possibly accommodate everyone who holds this knowledge, right? So today, I want to bring into the room the reflections, insights, and wisdom of the colleagues I deeply respect, people who have either have lived experience of incarceration themselves, or who have worked closely alongside those who advocate for the empowerment and inclusion of lived experience. I am going to share their definitions of what lived experience means as a way of creating a shared vocabulary throughout discussion. So first up, we have Scott Kidd from the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. Lived experience is not an anecdote or advocacy alone. It is a form of expertise generated through direct navigation of the criminal legal system and its consequences. It matters because it exposes the gap between how criminal legal systems are designed and how they are actually experienced by people, particularly those marginalized. When meaningfully integrated into policy, research, and reform, lived experience challenges deficit-based narratives, improves legitimacy, and leads to more humane, effective, and accountable justice practices without reform risking reproducing the very harms it seeks to address. Now, Scott is a lecturer at the University of Lincoln who has spent time in prison. Next, we have Associate Professor Jill Buck. For her, lived experience is knowledge shaped by direct involvement, not just observation or theory. My own early experiences were buffered by privilege and protective factors. Later, as a social worker and researcher, I witnessed how substance and criminalization and inequality can overwhelm lives, but also how people with lived experience lead recovery and change. Lived experience unsettles simple divisions between law-abiding and law-breaking people. There is potential for us to solve problems meaningfully from multiple perspectives, build solidarity, and expose the limits of professional interventions. When centered, lived experience can generate new, more humane pathways out of harm, just as it has in recovery movements globally. And finally, I share the insights of Dr. Danica Dali, and she says, for me, lived experience is the knowledge you earn with your body and soul, the things you learn from being inside a cell, talking through gaps in windows, or figuring out how surviving systems that weren't built for you. And that matters because policy and too often reform initiatives rely on numbers and theories. They don't capture what systems actually do to bodies, families, and futures, which leads to blind spots and avoidable harm. When voices like ours are taken seriously as an equal form of knowledge, the conversation becomes more honest and the solutions becomes grounded and humane. And that's how systemic change happens, by letting lived experience inform what needs to change, why, and what better could actually look like. And to share an expert from a recent book that I wrote with Danica, for us, lived experience is not an identity category, but a standpoint practice, an epistemic orientation grounded in proximity to state harm, whether that proximity is born of subjection, complicity, resistance, or some shifting braid of all three. There is no single answer, and perhaps there should not be. Lived experience is not a fixed identity. It is a situated perspective. It is not a credential to be claimed. It is a positionality to be interrogated. So now I've given you these definitions of what lived experience. Why does it matter? Because the way we know prisons and the way we design reform depends on what counts as knowledge in the first place. Knowledge is made up of different parts. The knowledge we use to understand prisons is not singular. It is made up of different ways of knowing, or in academia we call epistemologies. These epistemologies, or these different ways of knowing, shape what gets recognized as evidence, whose accounts are taken seriously, and what problems are deemed urgent. Epistemic Justice by Miranda Fricker helps us to kind of name those who are wronged as knowers, not only through material harm, but through being discounted, ignored, or misread in their capacity to produce credible knowledge about their own realities. So what happens when lived experience is excluded from reform? When prison reform is built primarily on official data, professional expertise, and legal administrative reasoning, it can become systematically partial. It tends to measure what institutions can easily count, rather than what imprisonment actually does to people's bodies, relationships, time, safety, dignity, and sense of belonging. The result is a knowledge blind spot, right? Reforms can look evidence-based while still being detached from the everyday textures of imprisonment. Those textures, for example, might include informal power and coercion, scarcity and deprivation, racialized governance and unequal treatment. But this is the core point. Without lived experience knowledge, reform can end up addressing what the system can measure, rather than what people inside prisons actually endure. And here's the next step to the argument. These different ways of knowing, these different epistemologies I showed you before, don't just sit on the page as knowledge, right? Over time, they get translated into discourses, the professional and political language that shapes what we think is happening. And discourses do something important. They shape how problems are created, understood, and represented. In other words, the way we talk about an issue becomes the way we decide what the issue is. So if we have a blind spot, if lived experience is missing, then our problem making is incomplete, right? Our problematization doesn't contain the full picture. And if the problem is only partial, then the solutions we design are not often aligned to what actually needs fixing. And this is where the influential work of Carol Barchi is really useful. Barchi's What's the Problem Represented to Be, or WPR, starts with a provocation. Policy doesn't just respond to problems, policy constructs the problems. So what governments name as the problem shapes everything that follows, right? What can be said, what can be done, who gets funded, and what can be measured as being successful. So let's apply this problem to prison overcrowding. Overcrowding is usually represented as a capacity management issue. It becomes about bed numbers, throughput, infrastructure shortfalls, efficiency in courts and corrections, right? And once overcrowding is framed that way, the solutions become predictable. Build more prisons, expand facilities, move people around, reclassify and transfer. But this is exactly where lived experience has to be central. Because if the problem is defined without people who have endured incarceration, we endure fixing the wrong thing. We end up addressing institutional inconvenience rather than the human harm that people actually endure. From the inside, overcrowding isn't just about not enough beds. It's a lived condition, and it's an intensified deprivation and scarcity. It's danger and violence. It's sickness and limited health. It's coercion and the loss of agency. It's a social breakdown and disconnection. So the point I want to make is if lived experience is excluded from how we represent the problem, then the reforms we're looking at are not very sensible because we're fixing the system, not the problem that the people who endure it themselves are actually experiencing. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, I'll keep talking. So, and Bachi's What's the Problem represented pushes us one step further as well. It asks what is left unproblematic when we cast overcrowding as a capacity issue. In other words, what disappears from view when the problem is framed as a bed numbers or capacity issue? Often, what gets backgrounded are the structural drivers: criminalization and over-policing, remand inflation, punitive sentencing settings, poverty and housing insecurity, untreated trauma and unmet health needs, colonial and racialized governance in other parts of the country. And in that framing, the prison is treated like a neutral container, as if the solution is simply to create more space, rather than questioning why are so many people being funneled into the space in the first place? Why are they there in the first place? Now, excluding lived experience creates a second problem: assumptive assessment needs. Policymakers and systems start inferring what people in prison actually need: more program, more supervision, more order, without actually co-designing with people who live these consequences. But that can misread what matters day to day inside. For many people, the urgent needs are far more basic and far more human: safety, dignity, access to healthcare, meaningful contact with family, protection from coercion and exploitation, workable pathways out, not just compliance pathways. So in these terms, this is a politics of representation. Solutions become tethered to what the system can easily deliver and measure, rather than what incarcerated people identify as urgent and transformative. And the outcome is predictable, right? Reform becomes legible to bureaucracy, good on paper, easy to report, while still remaining misaligned with lived realities inside prisons. Can you go to the next slide, please? Can someone click the next slide? Okay, no worries. I'll keep talking. So what changes when we bring lived experience into this kind of work? The task shifts from simply managing numbers to interrogating the framing itself, right? It reorients these three questions. What is the overcrowding problem being taken to be? Who benefits from the representation of the problem? And what alternative framings emerge when those most affected are the one defining the problem? Because when people with lived experience are at the center, the problem looks very different. It is not only about capacity, it becomes about harm, deprivation, those things I just talked about before. And I want to put this really bluntly. If incarcerated people are absent from the problem representation or problem creating space, overcrowding policy risks becoming a project of administrative optimization. In Australia, we have this saying, build prisons and the courts will fill them. And that's exactly what we'll do if we just keep building prisons. So, if the problem is that policy is being made about people rather than with people, how do we do this differently? How do we involve and empower people with lived experience of prison and the criminal legal process in a way that is ethical, practical, and sustainable? First, I want to name what often goes unspoken. For people who are new to this work, it can feel daunting. You may find yourself sitting across from people who have been directly harmed by the very systems and roles represented in this room. That discomfort is not easy to retreat. It is a sign that power is being brought into the open when it can be handled with care. The most defensible way forward is co-production, working as co-partners on equal footing with people who have been incarcerated. Now, co-production is not consultation. It's not a one-off focus group, and it's not inviting someone in at the end of the problem-solving or problem-creating space to validate what you guys already think. That's not it. Co-production means shared power and shared ownership across the whole policy cycle, defining the problem, setting the priorities, designing the responses, making decisions, implementing the changes, and evaluating what worked, what harmed, and what change must come next. What equal footing also means in practice is that it does not mean everyone does the same task. It means lived experience expertise carries real decision-making weight, not symbolic presence, not tokenism. It means people are resourced, supported, and protected to participate safely and meaningfully. Practical steps that can make co-production real are pay people for their expertise, time, and emotional labor, budget for it upfront, build support around participation, clear briefings, trauma-informed facilitation, and access to debriefings. Set shared ground rules, confidentiality, respectful engagement, and clear boundaries around what can and cannot be made. Don't make lofty promises that cannot be realistic. Create decision pathways, document what recommendations were made, what was accepted, what was not, and why, and report back. Now, co-production is not new. Co-production has been part of the social justice space for a long time, especially within the disability rights movement. And there are many examples of co-production within criminal justice. For example, Penal Reform International's Global Group of Experts by Experience. It's a formal group composed of people with lived experience of the criminal justice system, established to shape reform work globally. In the United Kingdom, we have user voice prison councils and consultations. It's a structured model of prison councils and consultations used to facilitate dialogue between those inside prisons and those that run the prisons. There are also international practice guidelines that was released this year by the ICPA. The takeaway here is simple, and I want to make this really simple. If we are serious about addressing the harms of imprisonment and not merely managing the system, then lived experience cannot be an add-on. It has to be built into how we define the problems, how we design solutions, and how we decide what success actually means. If prisons are decongested, does that equal success? Because across many jurisdictions worldwide, decongestion rates may be low, yet prisons are still widely understood to be failing, often returning people to the community more harmed, more precarious, and more marginalized than when they first entered the criminal legal system. And I want to end on this. Borrowing from the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. That needs to be an ethic and principle that guides the work that we do towards this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. First, allow me to apologize for the technical problem, but I'm sure everybody will agree with me that, it didn't matter. Everything you said was so exciting for me. I know that makes my teams very nervous. More work for all of us, particularly what you said about policy shaping the problem. Because always it's policy shaping the solutions that we are thinking of. But here, the way that policy shapes the problem will actually define the solutions that we will come up with. And that goes not just for decongestion, but for all types of reform work that we are doing. And that's why it's all very exciting for me. And I know you have 2 books, which I will, recommend to everyone to read. I think it should be mandatory reading, especially for our prison administrators. Thank you very much again, Dwayne. We'll get to talk more about what Dwayne said in a while. But for now, allow me to introduce our second speaker, Awande Mshatana. I hope I pronounced it correctly, who is the head of education at the People's Legal Center in South Africa. Awande holds an LLB, or a Bachelor of Laws, cum laude, from the University of South Africa, completing his degree while incarcerated. Demonstrating exceptional resilience, Awande is a founding fellow of the Global Freedom Fellowship Incarceration Nations Network. In 2024, he delivered a guest lecture at the University of Stellenbosch on criminal justice in action, and he was a panelist at the Flashlights Conference at the NYU School of Law, hosted by the Jailhouse Lawyers Initiative and the Robert and Helen Bernstein Institute for Human Rights. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Awande.
Greetings to the House at large. My name, as was stated, my name is Awande Mshotana. I'm hailing from Cape Town, South Africa. It's been a long trip to get here, but I'm very nervous, so please mind my voice and my presentation. So all protocol observed. I won't be able to greet everyone formally. As been stated, I am a young South African, 30 years of age. I am a former PDL. I'm still learning the abbreviations of the Philippines. I'm actually PRL now. So I am the head of education at a nonprofit organization in South Africa named People's Legal Center that was founded in 2022. People's Legal Center increases access to justice to communities, various communities. We do paralegal training on how we as communities can use the law, get to know, use, and shape the law to impact our communities much more better. So I joined the organization as an intern in 2022, and I've worked my way up to become the head of education. So working with People's Legal Center, I've also earned the privilege to work with many other nonprofit organizations within South Africa and also globally. As stated in my biography, that I've had the privilege to travel to New York, where I was at a conference in 2024, talking about jailhouse lawyers, which is a system that is a bit foreign in South Africa, or is a term that is foreign in South Africa. But jailhouse lawyers is actually who I was. So I studied my LLB degree during incarceration, and inspired by Nelson Mandela, actually, who also completed his LLB on Robben Island. So with completion of my LLB, that has gained me so much access to different platforms, such as this one today. In New York, upon my arrival, I met a very influential lady named Jody Polk, who introduced jailhouse lawyer concept to me. And with the collaboration in New York, I was able also to start and become part of a new pioneering initiative named Incarcerated Paralegal Congress. The International Incarcerated Paralegal Congress seeks to gather different formerly and currently incarcerated paralegals from all over the world, including here in the Philippines, actually, where one of our partners, or our founding partners, is HLAF, whom I'm sure all of you are very much aware of. But before I enter into my presentation, I think it would be very important for me to speak about my background, to bring my personal lived experience into the fore. I was incarcerated at the age of 17 in South Africa. Incarcerated at the age of 17, I was involved in gangsterism. As some of us may know, South Africa is a country that has high levels of violence. So that violence also attracted me, because within my poor and working class community, which are called the townships, gangsterism is the way, or is the motive to go as a young black man who's raised by a single mother. At the age of 17, at the age of 19, actually, I then got sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for the crime of homicide, which I, with my co-accused, committed. During my trial phase, imagine a teenager having to go to court and a judge and a prosecutor and a lawyer explaining Section 276G of the Criminal Procedure Act and how it works and functions and why I have been found guilty, which I didn't understand a clue. Upon my sentencing and incarceration, I then decided to complete my high school because at the time I was incarcerated, I was still in high school. I completed my high school during incarceration and managed to get 4 distinctions during my matriculation. And upon getting those 4 distinctions, I sat with the question of what do I do now? What's next? And then the next was inspired from me by Nelson Mandela with his quote, "Education is one of the most powerful tools to change the world," which, because he's like my inspiration, which then motivated me to pursue my LLB degree. Upon doing my LLB degree in prison, I then found empowerment. Empowerment not only to myself, but empowerment to my fellow incarcerated PDLs. I joined various programs while I was still incarcerated. One of them, if you would see in the pictures, was actually me teaching an outside university student about law. Oh, that's me actually while I was still in incarceration, so that's South African prison uniform. And we held with the University of Stellenbosch an internal moot competition where now I was not only the previous accused on a crime, but I was actually acting as an attorney and defending someone, practicing to be an attorney while I was still a law student. But what was most importantly, what I gained through studying the LLB was critical survival skills, because now I got to understood the criminal justice system of South Africa from the inside out. Coming from a blank page, but now filling up those blank pages with the law, with policy, and with the knowledge. I was able to shape the incarcerated system of the prison that I was in, which was in South Africa is regarded one of the worst prisons, and there's a documentary about it called Brandvlei Prisons, the most dangerous prison in South Africa. But under those circumstances, I had to push not only myself, but with my also fellow incarcerated PDLs. With understanding the law and shaping it within incarceration, it really transformed my life through education. It empowered my personal advocacy and increased my network. With the lived experience that I gained, I saw that it's did very much important work in terms of, as a social justice activist, I had to define my activism upon release. And another important aspect within the South African criminal justice system, which I think probably here in the Philippines could learn, and the judges as well in our presence, is that within my 15 years sentence in South African prison, the Criminal Procedure Act of South Africa creates an automatic right to parole. So within 50% of your sentence in South Africa, you have the automatic right to be granted parole, and you don't apply for parole. So that creates another level of encouragement for rehabilitation, because you don't apply for parole. It's an automatic system that the case management system of the South African Correctional Services does with or without your contribution as an incarcerated person. So within my time and being supported by a single parent, my mother, who actually was the one who first paid for my first year of studies, it really gave me something to look forward to. And then upon 2022, upon my release, my lived experience not only shaped the inside, but is currently also shaping the outside through the various work that I do. I don't only work with incarcerated people, but I also work with people who are living with disabilities. I work with the queer community, I work with refugees, and we shape the laws that affect them. And in terms of shaping the laws, we make sure that people understand not only what their rights are, but how to use the law. What can you actually do as a normal citizen without an LLB degree, without a lawyer or a prosecutor, or without even money? So with my activism and lived experience, I've been part of shaping policies that speak to people living with disabilities. I've been part of processes that shaped policies of refugees who are currently in South Africa, incarcerated or not. Lived experience brings that matter. Thank you so much, timekeeper. Lived experience does really bring a difference. It brings a difference in the context of those closer to the problem are closer to the solution, which is, I think, is what Dwayne was trying to share with us, that policy should actually shape the problem instead of just shaping the solution. Upon my work, I've been able also to work with the University of Stellenbosch, which is an Ivy League university. That is where I was sharing my lived experience with 300 students who are currently doing their LLB degrees, and showing them that it's very important to understand the law within its theoretical context, but also it's very to understand the law within its practical context, that whoever you are adjudicating against doesn't understand a single word of what that process looks or feels like. And now, why participation matters. Public participation is one of the key values and key foundational perspectives of my organization, People's Legal Center. We focus on public participation because we've seen how damaging the work of the state and the work of institutions, whether capital or government, can bring harm to communities with the use of capital, or with the intention of having profits, and instead of not considering communities. In South Africa, I work with various communities in and around South Africa, from Cape Town to Johannesburg, and I also still work with currently incarcerated people. So whenever there's a new policy, when public participation kicks off, we as People's Legal Center, we do community workshops to gain people's insights and submissions in terms of what the actual policy means for them and not what the policy means in terms of law. We also take that information back to our incarcerated brethren to shape how they, upon release, could actually be part of this process and could also start this process while still incarcerated. Public participation is essential for meaningful reform in the justice system. Decongestion efforts thrive when communities are included, leading to reduced recidivism and fostering a sustainable justice system that benefits all. Decongestion within many prisons also is primarily important. In South Africa, because of our parole system and because decongestion is not one of the key issues within our system, but rather violence is one of the key issues within our system. Because of the background of our communities and because of the history of violence we've had since apartheid. Public participation can shape not only the ones who are implementing the policies, can also shape the perspective of policymakers themselves, where policymakers can not only end policymaking within the legislature and parliament, but should also start being in the communities themselves, visiting the prisons, visiting the jails that people reside on. I would like to close off my presentation by stating that as a young South African and as a young global leader currently, being afforded this opportunity has really shaped how I view incarceration, and also has really shaped how privileged I was during my time in incarceration. Seeing how the Philippines justice system has really been appalling to me in terms of how the overcrowding is shaped, and how it has been normalized within not only the incarcerated people, but also the people that guard them, and how they've been able, the resilience of the Filipino people, to come up with solutions to fight the overcrowding, which is something for me really phenomenal. But to change that, it's really important that the people in this room start comparing other incarceral systems, not to bring them to the Philippines, but also just to shape and change what could work best for our people, and our people meaning the PDLs, our people meaning the PRLs, and how more PRLs can start joining these platforms and shaping the narrative of us being in these very much privileged positions that we are. So with those words, I would really like to thank UNODC for affording me this opportunity, and also to my fellow panelists, Dwayne, for the wonderful presentation before. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Awande. And it was really very edifying to listen to your experience and how you put yourself through school, being motivated by, your idol, Nelson Mandela. Who does not have him for an idol, right? So you did pretty well. Thank you so much for your sharing. Now we go to our third speaker, Mary Jane. Would you like to speak in English or in Tagalog? Okay. So the next speaker, Mary Jane, is a former, a person restored to liberty, formerly with the Quezon City Jail female dormitory. She was only recently released, last year, August of 2025, because of GCTA. So that's the law that allows good conduct time allowance for our persons deprived of liberty. So Mary Jane is married and she's currently employed at JNT Express, an express delivery company. And she has, since her release, been very active in helping out with not just the problem of congestion, but other issues that affect particularly women who are in conflict with the law. So, Mary Jane, maraming salamat sa iyong pagpa-unlock sa amin. Ngayon, bibigyan ka namin ng pagkakataon na ikwento mo sana sa amin yung mga naranasan mo na maaring makatulong sa atin sa pagbuo ng mga solusyon sa mga problemang ganito. Salamat. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mary Jane Gabrino.
Magandang araw po sa ating lahat. Isang karangalan po para sa akin ang maging bahagi ng Second National Decongestion Summit na ito. Ako po ay narito bilang isang dating person deprived of liberty na personal na nakaranas ng isang makatao at makatarungang sistema ng hustisya. Ako po si Mary Jane Pabigas Gabrino, isang dating PDL, isang taong minsan nagkamali, ngunit nabigyan ng pagkakataong magbago, matuto at magsimulang muli. Mahalaga pong mabigyan diin ang aking pagbabago ay hindi ko nagawa ng mag-isa. Sa loob ng aming pasilidad, may mga maayos, organisado, at programas sa rehabilitasyon. Natunay na humubog sa aming pagkatao ang aming mga programang ito ay malinaw na bunga ng mahusay na pamumuno ni Ma'am Jail Superintendent Dorbina L. Abrasado, DMS, CSE, katuwang ang lahat ng bumubuo ng Quezon City Jail Female Dormitory. Habang ako ay nasa loob ng piitan, sa ilalim ng programa ng Quezon City, No Woman Left Behind, ako po ay nakalahok sa iba't ibang programa, lalo na ang pagiging isang livelihood worker. Ang gawaing ito ay natuto sa akin ng sipag, disiplina, trabaho, at pananagutan. Ang aking kinikita mula sa livelihood program ay aking ginamit bilang pandagdag sa aking pang-araw-araw na pangangailangan. Nasa loob ng piitan na nagbigay sa akin ng dignidad at kakayahang tumayo sa sariling paa. Ako po ay nakatanggap ng kabuuang 5,290 pesos bilang isang livelihood worker. Kasabay neto, ako rin po ay nagpatuloy sa aking pag-aaral. Sa tulong ng mga programang pang-edukasyon, ako ay nakapagtapos hanggang grade 10 sa ilalim ng Jose B. Palma senior high school. Ang edukasyon ay naging mahalagang bahagi ng aking paghahanda sa muling pagbabalik sa lipunan. Ako din po ay nakapagtapos ng KKDK kung saan ay sumailalim sa counseling na may 24 modules. Dahil dito, unti-unting nahubog at nagbago ang aking pananaw patungkol sa droga. Kung paano ito may iwasan at tuluyang talikuran at wala itong magandang maidudulot sa akin at sa aking pamilya. Isa sa mga mekanismo nagbigay sa akin ng pag-asa ay ang GC, ang Good Conduct Time Allowance o GCTA. Ang GCTA hindi po simpleng pagbawas ng sentensya. Ito ay isang insentibo para mabuting asal, disiplina at aktibo sa mga programang pagrehabilitasyon. Dahil sa aking pagpusunod sa mga alituntunin at aktibong pakikilaw sa loob ng pigitan. Bilang livelihood worker at bilang mag-aaral, ako ay nabigyan ng maagang kalayaan sa pamamagitan ng GCTA. Ang araw ng aking paglaya ay hindi lamang pagtatapos ng aking sentensya at ito'y panimulang panibagong buhay. Ang bahagi rin po ng aking muling pagsisimula, ang patuloy na suporta matapos ang paglaya. Bilang isang dating PDL, ako po ay nakatanggap ng livelihood assistance na naghahalaga ng 5,000 pesos noong January 16, 2026. Mula sa Social Service Development Department ng Quezon City. Sa pamamagitan ng aftercare program ng Quezon City Jail Female Dormitory at ang No Woman Left Behind program na mahal na Mayor Joy Belmonte. Ang tulong na ito ay aking gagamitin bilang panimulang pamuhunan sa sari-sari source business. Ang katuwang ng aking pamilya, ako po ay patunay na kapag ang isang PDL ginabayan na mahusay na pamumuno, tuloy-tuloy ang aftercare suporta na may partisipasyon ng pamilya. Ang pagbabago ay hindi lamang posible, ito ay makabuluhan. Maraming salamat po sa UNODC, kay Ma'am Jail Superintendent Lorbina L. Abrasado, sa buong Quezon City Female Dormitory, at Quezon City Government sa patuloy na paniniwala, ang rehabilitasyon, dignidad ng tao ay ikalawang pagkakataon. Marami pong salamat at magandang araw po sa ating lahat.
Wow, thank you. Maraming salamat, Mary Jane. Lahat tayo nakaramdam ng emosyon, no? Especially what she said, that it was through her incarceration that she learned to stand on her own 2 feet, no? And through that, to have dignity, to finally feel, no, that way. And yung free life, the life outside, did not give her that kind of opportunity, diba? So it's really not just the experience inside, but also what brought them to become incarcerated. All these things should be part of the analysis in forging the solutions to this problem of congestion. So muli, maraming salamat sa iyo, Mary Jane. No, natutuwa kami na ngayon nandyan ka na sa punto ng buhay mo na may bagong simulain, no? At alam mo na marami palang tao na handang tumulong sa iyo at sa mga gaya mo. No? So now we'll go to our open forum so that we can give you a chance to ask questions of our experts here. And also, if it's not a question, it's just a comment or an observation, we welcome that also. For this part, I turn it over to Attorney Mike Navalio.
Thank you, Justice Monette. So if you have any questions, there are microphones in the middle of the room. Kindly approach the mic, introduce yourself, identify your organization, and tell us to whom you would like to address the question. Okay. There's one question on the left side of the room.
morning. I'm Josephine Lascano from Balay Rehabilitation Center, a civil society organization working on human rights and psychosocial rehabilitation. This is more of a reflection from my part on the inputs provided by our two resource person and of course, si Ma'am Mary Jane po. Maraming salamat. This is very inspiring, no, coming from you, Ma'am Mary Jane. We always say detention and incarceration is part of rehabilitation. But from our perspective, from the mental health perspective and well-being perspective, it is equivalent to healing. No? Therefore, if we take into consideration what our resource person have said, particularly participation of those who are in detention, those who have that lived experience, including trauma-informed practice, not only within the detainees, no, but also those who are into the justice system. Therefore, to my mind, it is a healing. Hence, there is really a need, not only on, the participation and lived experience, baka pwede pong i-put into consideration natin how can our justice system be a healing justice. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your comment. Dwayne, you want to say anything in response?
Can you hear me? Yeah, great. And that's a really good point. And I think one of the things I want to say is that, the criminal justice system and incarceration is often lauded for sometimes changing people's lives in a positive way. And thank you so much for sharing your story, Mum. It was really inspiring and I got a bit emotional. But imagine if Mum here could have experienced her ability to stand on her own outside of prison and not in the prison. She would have gone through less harm. She would have gone through less ache. The emotional and the emotion she experienced would have been a lot less. And the need for this idea of healing justice doesn't have to exist, right? And so I think the question that we should be looking into is how can we reduce our reliance on incarceration? Not just to build more beds, not just to make the justice space a healing justice, a place for prisons to become a space for the solutions, but how do we reduce our reliance in the first place of using prisons as the ultimate sanction? Because in this country, prisons are used wildly. There are many jurisdictions globally, and I'm thinking of Norway, I'm thinking of Finland and Sweden, that don't use incarceration. They truly use incarceration as a last resort. In addition, one of the things that was spoken about yesterday was on bail. There are many people in facilities that have not yet been convicted but spend long periods of time in detention. And so that in itself creates issues and problems. These are system inefficiencies, but these impact the way people actually feel things. And the one thing I want to say is, in prisons, we always talk about trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed care. But can there really be trauma-informed care and practice in a place like prison? I don't know. I'm skeptical.
So thank you so much for the reflection. What you just said and the story that was being shared made me reflect on a conversation that I had with a correctional official, where he said, it was a new correctional official, very young man. He reflected and said to me, I wonder, just because you are someone that I can have conversations with, I hope you don't feel offended by this, but when we count PDLs in the morning and count them at night, I no longer see you as human, I see you as animals. Because when I grew up in the rural villages, I used to count my father's sheep and goats in the morning and count them late at night. So incarceration as a system, to those who work on it, to those who implement it, no longer see the people inside as human beings because of how the conditions are. And I think it's very important for us to also just reflect on, it's not only the people who are inside that are important, but also the people that are working to ensure the people inside are safe. Because for them, they are the ones who can either shape the new Nelson Mandelas or they are the ones who can shape the new Pablo Escobars of this world. So it's really, really important to reflect in terms of how we see, how we view people who are inside in terms of their dignity, and how we can fight in terms of our internal biases that we have, social class, because understanding majority of the people in prisons either cannot afford bail or cannot afford legal representation, which automatically means that they are poor and working class. And the people who would become judges and justices would usually become those who are coming from elite universities, who have a privileged family that is not part of the working class, but middle class or elites. So looking into the idea of social class and prisons, I think it's very important. So the Philippines is much more different than South Africa, where race is an issue, where race, we always call it out that majority of the people in prisons are people of color, black and brown people. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Mike, can I just say something
Sure,
in
please go ahead,
response to what Hawande said? That is really very disturbing, you know, because that's how we look at things. We're always looking for data and statistics. We're counting number of people vis-a-vis the square footage of every cell. That's how we have been trained to assess the problem. And so he really has surfaced a very, very big, I think, stumbling block for coming up with solutions that are not just going to be permanent, but are really going to be sustainable. Because, you know, if we keep on, you know, focusing on just the numbers, we are not really solving anything. And that goes to all our reform projects in general, because now all we want are, you know, how do we assess? We want metrics, we want assessment criteria, we want indicators. That's all we're talking about, because, you know, we want to be able to proclaim to people like, okay, we disposed of our cases in X amount of time or in X number of months. But is that really what we need to solve the problems that beset us? Not just jail decongestion, not just jail congestion, but also docket congestion in our courts and case delay. So thank you very much for bringing that up with us. And I think to include Mary Jane, maybe pwede natin siyang tanungin, Mike, because healing was mentioned as in the commentary. Yung proseso mo ng pagbubuo ulit, no, yung nawala yung dating mga dinadala mo sa iyong kalooban, yung epekto sa iyo nung pagkakakulong mo, baka pwede mong i-share sa amin.
Yung naging epekto po ng pagkakakulong ko, ma'am. Number 1 po, yung mawala ka sa pamilya. Yun yung isang number 1 na pagkakamali ko na pinasok ko. Dahil ultimo pamilya mo, pamilya ko nasira. Kaya yun sa pagkakakulong ko, pinilit kong baguhin yung sarili ko, ma'am. Para sa aking paglaya uli. Makasama ko uli yung pamilya ko, maging maayos uli yung buhay ko. May ituwid ko po lahat ng mga naging mali ko noon. Dahil sa pamamagitan ng droga, wala talaga magandang naidudulot sa isang tao na kailangan kalimutan at talikuran lahat na mga gulumba. Kaya sa loob ng city jail, ng female dormitory, marami po akong natutunan doon. Katulad nung nag-livelihood ako na pwede kong i-apply sa labas, inaituro ko sa mga anak ko. Tapos yung nag-aral po ako doon, nag-INC po ako kasi nag-religious po ako doon. So naging magaang po yung pagkakakulong ko nung salihan ko lahat ng mga activities sa loob ng female dormitory. Kaya sabi ko po, paglaya ko, mag-uumpisa ako ulit sa una. Kasama ang aking pamilya. Yun lang po.
Maraming salamat, no, Mary Jane. So again, that's another thing we should probably look into. We have all these programs, no, for assistance to victims in criminal offenses. Of course, the rights of the accused are guaranteed, but we rarely talk about efforts to make the accused whole again, or to make the person deprived of liberty or the person incarcerated or convicted and who is subsequently released, no, whole again. How do you restore that person? We say that that person is restored to liberty. But literally, the time, the 8 years, for example, spent in jail, they can never get that back again. So how do we approximate the damage to them, the damage to their family, their loved ones, to their careers, if they had careers before they were incarcerated? And now how do you try to make them whole again? If not completely whole, at least partly. No? And that should go into our discussions as well. So because otherwise, the concept of reintegration will not be complete. It will just be a physical going back to the community, but the person who's going back is not the same person because that person will never be whole again unless we do something about it. Okay?
All right.
Thanks, Mike. So
I think we have time for more questions. Please go ahead, approach the mic.
Sorry.
Kindly introduce yourself.
I'm Isabelita Solamo from Filipina Legal Resources Center. I would just like to share one good practice in the Davao region, the College Behind Bars. It started at the Davao City Jail, and it has partnership with the BGMP and the State College, the University of Southern Philippines in Davao City. It has courses in food technology, agriculture, computer science. So we say that the reentry starts and the preparation starts while the person is in jail. And the good news also is that it has expanded to the former Davao Penal Colony and also in partnership with the Davao del Norte State College. So a person inside the jail is able to complete either a high school or a college degree. Thank you.
It's very interesting. Would you want to comment on that?
you want to comment, Dwayne?
I mean, prison education.
By the way, Dwayne is a kababayan.
Yes.
No, and he has been translating for a one day. when Mary Jane is speaking in Filipino, let's give a warm round of applause to our kababayan.
Thank you very much. And I'm actually also from Davao. I was born in Davao.
Oh, wow.
So it's nice to see someone from Davao. No, there's plenty of evidence that shows that prison education is important and prison education can reduce pathways to reincarceration. But I think one of the things that I always say, and maybe one day can add to this doing the GFF work with Professor Baz, is that education needs to be meaningful. And the last time I was in the Philippines, I went around prisons and I was learning about the college courses that was offered here in the Philippines. But it needs to be meaningful, right? To have just kind of the tick box, you can do high school, you can do college, doesn't actually work. Just like when you're in the community, you want to become a lawyer, you want to become a doctor. Only then can education actually be helpful for you and for your rehabilitation, for your reintegration. And I wanted to add one more thing with your comment before. There's a famous book in criminology called Prison on Trial, and chapter 2 is called Rehabilitation. And we often assume, right, that when a person goes to prison, the term rehabilitation, in other words, is to return them to their state of efficient working state. But that assumes that the person who went to prison was or had an efficient working state in the first place. And so can we really rehabilitate that person to this ideal vision of what we think is a good person if that person didn't have the resources and skills to do it? And so I think the conversation also needs to be about, yes, programs are good in prison, but can those programs be done outside of prison while they're with their families, while they're with their communities? And there are many models globally. For example, in South Australia, we have electronic monitoring anklets, where people have to go into certain facilities to do the rehabilitation, but every day they go home to their families. Every day they see their mom and dad. It's also, you no longer need these programs to reintegrate people because you never took them out of society in the first place.
Awande, education is your passion?
I think, so I would like to make an example of Kenya. There are dear comrades of mine who are running a justice program called Justice Defenders, where they do a one-year paralegal course that is accredited through the University of London. There, they don't only teach paralegal skills to incarcerated people, but they join the class with the prison wardens. They both learn together in the same class, and they both become paralegals at the same time. So that doesn't only create, in terms of education program that is empowering people who are incarcerated, but also empowers the staff itself. And the current Kenyan prisoner commissioner nationally was a former student from that program who went on to do his LLB and went on to do his master's in law with the intention of wanting to reshape the Kenyan prison system. So not only change can come from empowering people who are inside, but also the people who are working inside, very much important in terms of shaping that narrative and changing that narrative. So education has to be meaningful, and for me, that's a clear example of meaningful education, because you're not developing one and leaving out the other, you're developing the whole community, because we end up becoming a community while we're still inside. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Si Mary Jane, tanungin natin, kasi nung nandun siya sa female dorm, doon siya nakapag-aral, di ba? At ngayon, para sa'yo, di ba, yan ang nagbigay ng bagong pag-asa sa inyo ng iyong mga anak.
Opo.
Ikwento mo
Kaya
na sa amin.
sinabi ko sa mga anak ko, hindi porket nakulong ako, hinayaan ko yung sarili ko. Sabi ko, mga anak, habang nasa loob ako, pinagpatuloy ko yung pag-aaral ko para paglaya ko, may panibagong kinabukasan ako na pwede kong i-share sa inyo kung ano man yung naranasan ko sa loob. Kaya nga habang nag-aaral po ako noon, nagla-livelihood program ako. Sa umaga, nag-aaral, sa hapon, nagla-livelihood program. Dahil para sa sarili ko, para makatayo po ko sa sarili ko mga pa. Dahil mahirap po na walang suporta ng mga pamilya kasi lalo na po mahirap yung buhay sa labas. Kaya hindi ko na rin po sila inasahan kung dadalaw po sila o hindi. Basta sa akin, nasa maayos lang po sila nakalagayan. Yun lang po, lagi kong iisip sa kanila.
Anong naramdaman mo nung nakatapos ka? Siguro sobra-sobra
Sobrang
yung
saya ko, ma'am.
kaligayahan mo.
Nang nakapagtapos po ako sa tulong ng livelihood program ng female dormitory. Malaking ano po yun sa akin, ma'am. Yung umakyat po ako ng entablado. Sinabi ko sa mga anak ko, kahit na nakulong ako, kailangan mag-aral din. Kasi kung sakali, ma'am, wala ako, yan lang din na maitutulong ko sa kanila. Yun lang po.
Salamat. Mike?
Right. I note that we are pressed for time, but we will finish all the questions from the three ladies in the room. Meanwhile, you can already take your merienda. So this is a working merienda, so we can finish this very interesting discussion. Next question, please. Attorney Glenda.
Yes. Hi, I'm Attorney Glenda Litong from the UP Institute of Human Rights. And I welcome the presentations. If I may synthesize the presentations, it's something that is a model for reform, no? Prison reform, especially what Dwayne said about decongestion as not just an issue of capacity. if I may add to it, it's also not just about an issue of processes. So yung processual is part of the problem-solving aspect, not just about capacities, but if based on the realities in the Philippines, especially of women incarcerated or women in conflict with the law, there are certain lived experiences that are rooted in gender. No? In fact, there has been studies about why women offend. And if we look at the 4 pathways why women offend, it is related to direct or symbolic retaliation for abuse and victimization. It is connected to hard living and economic need, which is, of course, related to gender constructs. There are certain substance abuse issues, and of course, also in terms of deception and betrayal in close relationships. So these are the whys, no, of certain identities, why they offend. My question now is there a place in this framework presented before us of interrogating the whys, why certain identities offend, and how the processual as well as the capacity issues would also look into that? So I'm more into the norms, standards, and substance. So the question is for all. I'm not sure. I hope Mary Jane can also contribute. Pero more so with Dwayne, having presented the framework, and also with, I forgot.
One day.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, Glenda.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. And it's really interesting that you brought that, actually, because I'm in the middle of a research project here in the Philippines looking at, there's a framework in criminology, what we call the pains of imprisonment. And there are 5 pains of imprisonment. These things include safety and security, heterosexual relationships, etc., right? But in the Philippines, that framework of the pains of imprisonment that was created in 1957 has not been adapted to women. And we know throughout the globe, through the research of amazing researchers like Pat Carlin and Bree Carlton, who have done this work in the US and in the UK, that these experiences are different. Now, if these experiences are different, the interventions should also be different. But at the moment we look at offending, at the moment we look at rehabilitation through a non-gendered lens. But as Ma'am shared here, offending and the way people commit crimes and the way what those motivations are heavily gendered. And so I'm in the middle of field work for the research that you're actually asking, and I'm going around the country next year, or this year rather, looking at what are those unique pains of imprisonment that women face that men don't in the context of the Philippines, and what support systems and services can we offer that men might not need but women need. One of those kind of, I did field work already in Mandaluyong City Jail, and one of the preliminary findings I found was a pain of imprisonment that they experience that men don't have is a lack of sanitary goods, for example. There is, and I interviewed officers, I interviewed people throughout the country, and there was this, it's their responsibility. Now, I take the view that if a state incarcerates a person and takes their liberty away, it is the state's responsibility to provide those goods and services to that person. But yes, thank you for your question, and once I get those results, I'll be happy to share them.
Thank you. Awande?
So what I would like to share is, from that South African lens, is that in South Africa, the incarceration of women causes more harm in society than the incarceration of men. Women, they are the primary caregivers of many families, and they are also the primary supporters of many men during incarceration. So they are the ones who come and visit, they are the ones who come and give affection. But the more you take away women from society, the more you take away that motherly support that is needed. So more damage is done into the fabric of our societies with more and more women becoming incarcerated. And a gendered approach towards rehabilitation really does not exist around the world, because I think women are a minority to those who are incarcerated, and they usually don't get the primary care that they do require and the needs that are gender focused. So I think that's when participation comes into the flow, where how do women's voices can be shaped in terms of this narrative of creating policies that speaks to women. When we're speaking about BUCO, when we're speaking about jails in the Philippines, what does that mean within the context of women, within that reshaping the issue of decongestion?
It might interest you to know that right now we're in the process of drafting the first ever manual and protocol for handling cases involving women in conflict with the law. And we're incorporating, of course, the Mandela rules and the Bangkok rules. But this point is something that's central to the work that we're doing. And I think your study is going to be a big help to us. So we will get in touch with you. Please share it with us. Just as a further to the example given by Dwayne, I have visited several female facilities, female penal facilities. And one of the central things that I always observe is that they don't have adequate, not just equipment and facilities, but even the basic or fundamental medicines for pregnant women. No? And so if you are infanticipating, you are supposed to get a monthly checkup. But since they don't have the equipment for it, they have to bring the female PDL outside of the jail. And that's the problem. For you to do that, you have to go to court and ask for permission from the judge. And sometimes before that order is issued, the woman would have given birth already. And so they would have gone on for how many months without an actual prenatal checkup. So that's one of the things that, jails were, sorry to say, originally just intended for men in our society. And so that's something that is a huge gap in our prison systems. Of course, there are efforts but it all requires in-depth thinking. It's not just a matter of supplying this and that equipment or this and that medicine. It really has to go deeper than that. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
So we still have time for 2 more questions. We have Ines.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Ines Peria from Nobox Philippines. We work on drug policy reform grounded in harm reduction and human rights alongside people whose lives include drugs. So thank you to our resource persons for grounding this summit in a simple, basic, but often missed truth. How lived experience is not an add-on. It changes what problems we see, what solutions we design, and what we count as success. And I also really appreciate the insistence that participation cannot be symbolic, and that people with lived experience must be treated as equal partners, especially in identifying harms, shaping responses, and evaluating what works. In our context, criminalization and a drug-free, abstinence-free framework still shapes the system. And so people whose lives include drugs are often approached through control and compliance, not treated as legitimate partners and knowledge holders. And that constrains participation before it even begins. Knowing that drug law and our policies are the main drivers of overcongestion, where most of the cases there are drug-related. And if we take your message seriously, what would it take concretely for justice and other institutions to share real decision-making power with people whose lives include drugs in designing, monitoring, and defining success in decongestion and justice reform? And what is one commitment this summit can make for us to move from where we are now to equal partnership with people whose lives include drugs?
Anybody wants to answer that question?
Yeah, so
Wait.
I mean, one of the things I always say is that it's great that we're involving people with lived experience, that the 3 of us are here today. But the next question that I ask is, how do we make this sustainable? How do we make this normal? How do we make this part of everyday decision and process making? And the one thing I say, in particular in the context of the Philippines, where drug use does carry a stigma, people who go to prison are stigmatized, is that we first have to invest in social capital and social investment in changing people's perceptions. How do we destigmatize the process of being entangled within the criminal justice system? Because everyone in this room could be pro-lived experience, pro-people, but once we leave this room, our constituents, the people we represent, the people we work for, the people that are in the Philippines might not agree with you, then these interventions will fail. So we have to invest in the broader picture. How do we change people's perceptions about criminalized people? That's the first thing. And that's how we make this sustainable. The second thing about this idea of a buy-in that you said, I think, you know, if this was my choice and if I was in this organizing committee, for me, I would want this organizing committee to make a commitment to including a lived experience person or establishing a subcommittee that looks at all the processes that this organization creates and provide this subcommittee, these group of people with lived experience, real decision-making processes. And then we start to work together to create solutions. And then we start to break down barriers between, you know, you're the person in prison and I'm the officer or the judge or whatever it may be. And then we start to create this community of healing that you spoke about before.
You brought up a very thorny topic. So through my very limited observation of the Philippines and its drug policies, which I personally think are excessive, in the context of it punishes the end user more than the actual distributor in terms of now how these drugs are coming into the country. So it would have been really amazing for me to see that jails would have been full of people, of government officials, people who are working at harbors where the drugs are actually coming from and where you find tons and tons of drugs are being reported to be confiscated within the Philippine system. But the punishment of the end user, which is so excessive, where in my country, the excessive punishment goes to the actual manufacturer. That's where you'll find someone who will get more than 20 years to life imprisonment if you are manufacturing drugs. So you are the root cause of the harm. And the end user, because of poverty and socioeconomic issues, they don't see any other means of surviving and forgetting the poverty and forgetting the situation. So, and that is not only, end users are not only families, but also very much young people. So the manufacturer is the one who's killing the future generation of our society. So for me, I would say through the courts, and I've seen that you guys also have a wonderful constitution, and through civil society, maybe you should start applying to declare that drug laws are unconstitutional because they don't treat people with equality. It's excessive, and I think it's an abuse of human rights to actually sentence someone for using drugs to 30 years imprisonment. That's my personal opinion.
All right. Justice would like to
Thank you. Just very quickly, that the Supreme Court, for its part, for example, when we formulate new rules or guidelines, we recently promulgated the victim-sensitive guidelines in criminal cases, and we included in our drafting committee people with lived experience as victims of trafficking, victims of sexual abuse cases, and it's the same thing we're doing in the crafting of the WICL manual and protocol. We have former PDLs who are part of the group. So that to us is already mandatory. So we insist on lived experience being part of our policy making. Yes.
All right.
Just quickly, just to reiterate, we don't have to answer the question, but the second question was, what is one commitment this summit can make now for us to move from where we are to equal partnership with people whose lives include drugs? So it's not lived and past, but there's so many communities where people live with drugs everyday lives in the communities. So I think that's something that I hope there would be space for us to sit down and collaborate on what it would take for them to participate fully in the whole decision-making process. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Inez. We'll go to our last question for this panel. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sophia Opperman. I'm a Fulbright scholar from the US, and I'm currently working with the Humanitarian Legal Assistance Foundation. And my research, both here and in the US, focuses on criminal justice reform led by the lived experiences of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. And sort of similar to the previous question, I was wondering, and I appreciate the concrete examples that you've given of ways to consider incorporating lived experiences here. I'm wondering if you could share any examples that you've seen of true power sharing between institutions, between justice institutions and folks with lived experience, if any, and what the outcome was in terms of how it favored justice-impacted people.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. No, I can't. And there's a really simple reason, is that lived experience is really new. And in fact, I'm very surprised to be in the Philippines talking about this. It's a very new and innovative reality. I mean, at least within criminal justice. You know, when we look at the history of lived experience in the disability rights movement, in mental health, there's a long history dating back from the 70s and 80s where lived experience folks are leading the movement and leading the change. But in the context of criminal justice, it's a very new thing. I mean, the term lived experience criminology, lived experience in criminal justice has been only coined 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, of course, there have been a long history of people like Nelson Mandela making these moves, but actually incorporating it into everyday spheres is relatively new. There are some good examples that are showing positive results. The first one is an organization in the United Kingdom led by Paula Harriet, who was incarcerated in the UK for 10 years, and she's now the CEO of an organization called Unlock. Now, Unlock provides services to people that have criminal records wanting to get a job. So in the context of the United Kingdom, people there want to, can't get jobs because of their criminal record. That's one example. The other really good example that I provided was User Voice. Now, I don't think this is public knowledge, but in His Majesty's Prison Service in the United Kingdom, there is now an executive director for lived experience within the Bureau. And that's a role, and their job is to look at how can we embed lived experience across the entire organization. How can we make this part of everyday life? And one of the initiatives that they came up with was this idea of a peer worker, a peer, instead of having psychologists who went to university but have never interacted with anyone in prison, they established peer work models where people who have been to prison that have been released now go back into prison and provide services and support. And so that's, I think, a good example of something that's growing in the space. But this is a new space, and there is, I think, plenty of space for the Philippines to be innovative and a leader in this space if we really put investment into it. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
So when you're talking about like true power sharing in terms of lived experience examples, well, the first one is here in the Philippines, actually. Raymond Narag. So Raymond Narag has been really, there he is, been really shaping in terms of how the incarceral system here has been working in terms of his research. And he is a person with lived experience, so he's really been inspiring me. And he's involved in every door, actually, of the Philippines government, the Interior Department, Justice Department, the Jail Department. So he's everywhere. So Raymond Narag is really that true example for me, but he must not be the only one. That's the other key aspect. And then an example from South Africa. And an example from South Africa is from Pastor Clinton. Pastor Clinton was incarcerated for 6 years, and in the after 1998, he started the first restorative justice program, where restorative justice in South Africa was not even a norm. But now, currently, he serves part of the National Steering Committee of Parliament, steering restorative justice programs and also shaping the parole system within South Africa. So there are those few examples, but there's just like few of us who are actually afforded a seat on the table. And I think in terms of power sharing, we, as people with lived experience, should start creating our own tables now, because we are making connections. I know Raymond, he's based in the US. I'm now exposed to Dwayne, who's based in Australia. Maybe we should start our own international table, our own sort of UNODC to shape the narrative through lived experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So on that note, we end this panel discussion. A warm round of applause, please, to our moderator, Justice Maria Filomena Singh, our speakers, Dwayne Antojado, Owande Mishotana, and Mrs. Mary Jane Fabregas Gabrino. We're just about to break now to our breakout sessions, but before we do that, let me just acknowledge the presence of Supreme Court Associate Justice Raul Villanueva. Good morning, Justice. And as announced, we are now going to our breakout sessions. We have 4 breakout sessions, so we're trying to flash on the screen the slides. On your tables, you will find a list of breakout sessions where you are enlisted. So kindly find your way to your breakout sessions. We have session 1 on Restorative Justice Handbook of the UNODC. That's on Rigodon Ballroom 1, just behind this stage. If you exit to your right, that's the first door you will see. You will have session 2 on Thinking Justice, Protocols for Women in Conflict with the Law. That's on Rigodon Hall 2. That's the second room you'll find just behind this stage if you exit to your left. And then session 3 is on CLEP experience and law students' engagement in decongestion. That's the third room. And for those attending the 4th session, democratizing GCTA calculation to boost timely releases, kindly stay in this ballroom. This will be your breakout session room. So we'll see you again at about 1:25 this afternoon for the plenary on the second day of the National Decongestion Summit. Thank you and good morning.